What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. Glad you can join us this morning. If you're new, my name is Damon Hill, and on this channel we talk about photography and videography, specifically from the standpoint of being a beginner. So I think you'll find today's video very helpful, especially if you're a beginner. Today I'm going to be giving you 5 tips for beginners from a beginner. Tip number 1. Don't go crazy buying all the expensive equipment right away. It's not necessary. You can take great pictures even with inexpensive equipment. For example, I didn't go out and buy the most expensive Canon camera. I'm using the Rebel EOS T8i, and it takes great pictures. Now, the one thing that you probably do want to think about is maybe not spending so much money on the body of the camera, but focus on the glass or the lens, because that's where you can make a huge improvement in your photography. Because camera bodies are always changing, they're always coming out with new features, but a good lens can last you a long time and can be used on different bodies as you progress. Now, typically when you buy a new camera, if you're buying a inexpensive one, maybe around $800 to $900, it typically comes with a kit lens like my Canon did, which takes decent photos, but I knew I needed to upgrade the lenses. So what I did was I got 2 specific lenses, and I suggest that you start out with a primary or fixed lens, and that's a 50mm. Now, if you've done some research and watched some videos on YouTube, you've probably heard about this lens referred to as the Nifty 50. And it's nifty because it's handy in many different applications. So it's a great lens to have. One of the best things about it is it has a very shallow depth of field. You can take some great pictures with a 50mm. Play around with it, use it. You'll find that you really like the Nifty 50. Another lens that I suggest you get, and especially if you're going to be vlogging, is you need a little bit more of a wider angle lens. So I suggest that you start out with a 10 to 18mm. That's the lens that I'm currently using for this video. Having a 10 to 18mm lens allows you, especially when you're vlogging, to get a wider angle and you won't be so close to the camera itself. Using that 10mm, it's a great lens to have. Now, camera lenses is not the only thing you need. You need other gear to build out your kit. And if you're interested, I posted a video a couple of weeks ago. I'll put a link up right here. I suggest you watch that video. You'll be able to see the other kind of gear and camera equipment I got for my kit. Now, if you like what you see in these videos that I'm posting, please think about subscribing to my channel. Hit the like button if you like this video, and I suggest that you hit notifications so that way you're aware of when I drop new videos. Now that moves us on to tip number 2, which is get to know your camera. You've hopefully purchased a camera by now. You've got your lenses, you're ready to go. I suggest you get used to your camera settings. Make sure that when you get the camera to look through all the settings, look through your manuals for that camera, mess around and experiment with some of the settings so that you're familiar with the camera and how to operate it. Remember, your camera is a tool. And as anybody who wants to use a tool to do anything, you need to be skilled to be able to use that tool properly. So the more that you use your camera and that you become familiar with its settings and functions, the better you'll be at using that camera as a tool to become a better photographer. Now that leads us to tip number 3. And that is to understand what shutter speed and aperture and ISO are. Those are 3 of the most important things that you need to learn to become a better photographer. You need to understand what these are and how each of them affects the pictures and videos that you take. And that leads me to a sub-tip. We'll call it 3A, and that is trying to use your camera and get used to manual mode. The best thing that you probably want to do when you're first starting out is to use the automatic settings. Your camera is probably very good at determining, for the most part, the best shutter speed and aperture and ISO settings, and you can take some great photos and video using the automatic settings. But if you really want to improve your pictures and videos, you need to understand what those 3 components are. And one of the best ways to learn that is to use manual mode. And I suggest that you experiment with those settings as well. As you experiment with them, you'll start to understand how changing each of those affects your photos and videos. video. That leads me to tip number 4, and that is to determine if you're going to shoot in RAW or JPEG. Now, shooting in JPEG is a great way to start out in photography. One of the biggest advantages of shooting in JPEG is that the camera does all the post-processing for you of that photo. Shooting in JPEG can be great for new photographers because using the automatic settings of your camera and shooting in JPEG means that you just need to identify your subject and take the picture, and the camera does all the rest, adjusting the white balance, the ISO, the colors, and other settings to get you to your final image. One of the drawbacks of shooting in JPEG is that it's lower quality, you get less detail and less color options. It still takes great photos, but because of those drawbacks, that's why many photographers shoot in RAW. Shooting in RAW allows you to take uncompressed photos where you can bring out later more detail, more highlights, and increased brightness in your photos. Shooting in RAW also has a higher dynamic range, so you get more light and more shadows. One thing to remember when you're determining whether you're going to shoot in RAW or JPEG is typically shooting in JPEG, you don't have to do a lot of editing in post or after you take the picture. Most of the time they turn out great and they're great for sharing. If you're going to shoot in RAW, typically you're going to do some kind of editing in post, and that may be using an application such as Photoshop or Lightroom. That does take some work. Pick JPEG for quick and easy shots and choose RAW for detailed and stylized shots that you can edit in post. Now that leads us to our final tip, tip number 5, and that is try to take your camera with you all the time. Try to have it available so that you can shoot photos. It's a numbers game. The more photos you shoot, the better you get as a photographer. The more you shoot, the more experience you'll have with your camera. The more you shoot, the more you'll understand your camera as a tool, and it gives you the best opportunity to get great looking shots. Those are my 5 tips from a beginner for beginners. I hope you found that what I shared today is helpful. Again, if you find it helpful, if you enjoy the videos that I'm making, please think about hitting the subscribe button, like this video, leave comments. I'd love to hear from you about what you think about my tips. And I'd also like to hear if you have tips that you'd like to share with me, because I'm a beginner and I want to get better along with you. So I'm glad you can join me today, and I hope that you can join me on future videos as I learn to become a better photographer.